Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about data test IDs. And data test IDs are a concept that, was really introduced by this React testing library as a way to better identify your components. Because in the ways that you were doing it with something like Enzyme is you would actually look for things by the component name. And that seems great, but I guess it isn't really that great, right? Because we're not actually working, the user is never working with components, they're working with, DOM elements, right? So we should be working with DOM elements too. But that kind of makes occasionally finding things a little bit difficult. For instance, right now we're doing a get by text and we're looking for 0. But the moment we increment this button, this text is no longer going to be 0 and this test is going to break. You could illustrate that simply by just saying, keeping the initial count to 1 and the test is going to fail. Okay, so let's talk about ways that we can identify things. Now, you don't have to use these. You can identify things in different ways. Maybe you want to look for things by their text, and that can definitely work. Like if you just want to check to make sure that something is here, right? If we want to make sure that there is a text of 0 here, or maybe a button that says submit or something like that, we could just check to see if that text is there and then do a to be truthy, right? But let's go ahead and actually do this a little bit more interesting, where we can attach a data ID to the DOM node, and then that way we can always find this particular DOM node, whatever it may be. For instance, if this is going to be a counter button, we can give this a data hyphen test ID. And this is just going to be a simple string where we'll call this counter button, okay? Now this seems maybe a little extraneous, but this is going to come in handy when you just want to identify something and, maybe this could possibly change, or maybe there'll be multiple buttons. Maybe there's a reset button or something like that, but there's a lot of reasons why this could come in handy. I'm going to copy this counter button text and I'm going to head to my counter.test.js. And in the last video we did this debug. I added some little notes in here for you. What I want to go ahead and do is I'm going to copy this expect line. I'm going to comment this one out. And instead of get by text, we're going to get by, and you'll see that we have test ID as one of the options. Now, get by test by ID is really only exists for React testing library. You're not going to have this in Enzyme, okay? And now, for instance, we want to say the counter button, okay? And so we're going to want to go ahead and get the counter button, and we can make sure that it is in fact a button by just saying tag name to be button, okay? But let's go ahead and do something else here. We can expect wrapper get by test ID counter button, and we can say dot text content to be 0. Okay, and now when we increment this, we can expect it to be 1. You can see both of these pass. And this is all good. We're still getting our little debug out here. We can always comment the debug out. But let's go ahead and talk about how we can clean this up. Because this is great, right? But this code is long. We're doing wrapper.getTestID. We're doing wrapper.debug. You might be thinking, this is a perfect situation for destructuring. And do we ever use wrapper itself? Well, not yet. So we can go ahead and turn this into a destructuring of wrapper and just say debug, as well as get by test ID. Now we don't have to say wrapper dot anymore. We can just say debug. And we don't have to say wrapper dot get by test ID. We can just say get by test ID. And this is going to make our tests a little bit more concise here and easy to read. All we simply need to do is pull out these methods from in here. Now, anytime we want to pull out another one, we just have to come in here and say comma, and then we could start typing. Now, the cool thing about working on something like VS Code is it's automatically going to let you know what's available in here. And it gives you the options here to see exactly what kind of different things. Get by text, title, alt text, that sort of thing. Okay? So check it. So this is really, really super neat. Now, if you're upset by the fact that there's test and expect underneath here, let's go ahead and take a second to fix that. In my code here, I have a eslint.rc or .eslint file right here. Now, if you have hidden files turned on, you'll see this in Finder. If you don't, you may not see this file. This is basic an eslint file, and all we want to do is add some globals into this ESLint file. And this is going to just make it so we simply don't need to import these, and ESLint won't care. We can have a new string in here named globals, and this is going to be, we'll have several globals in here. For instance, we'll have test, and we need to have the value of true. And then we're going to have another one, which is expect. And this is also going to be true. And then we'll also be adding to this as we use more things, but this is good for now. If we head back to our test, you can see that our red underlines have gone away, which makes me very happy. So let's check it out. Our test has gotten a little bit more elegant, right? We render the component now with this simple render, and we're able to have access to both debug and get test by ID. Well, we debug it just because we want to. In reality, and when your tests are all passing, you can remove this debug. You don't even need it unless you need it. And to be honest, I use it all the time. Debug is super duper handy, so don't feel like it's a bad thing to use debug. Next, we're going to assert, we're going to assert, this is assert that the text value is 0 found within a button. I'm going to go ahead and delete this old test because we're not going to be using it, but we're going to assert that the counter button is a button. You don't need these comments either, but I like these to be in here for when you're learning. And then next, we're going to also assert that counter button starts at 0. Okay. Now, some really important things to test or to make note of here in this. A lot of people will say, well, how do I test that state is equal to 10 at this point? How do I test that state is equal to 5? How do I test that when I click the button, it runs the set state? And in this series, as well as recommendations from React Testing Library, you don't test those things. What you do is you test to see the output in the DOM. So right now, simply by having the test button start at 0, we just need to check the DOM to see if the value that's output is actually 0. And when we click the button, we're going to check to see if the output is 1 or 2 or whatever it may be after we add to it. So again, don't get hung up on what React is doing itself. We want to keep this always in the focus of what's happening in the DOM, because after all, that's what your users end up seeing. They don't see or even know or care about React, okay? So check it out. This is cleaning up our tests considerably, and we've now used test IDs to identify some of our components. Now, we won't always be using test IDs, but they can come in super duper handy as a way to, well, assign something a value in context of testing without necessarily getting in the way of the implementation in the code. So check it out. In the next video, we're going to take this one step up and we're going to add some action here. We're going to give the ability to update this button, and we're then going to trigger some clicks on the button and see if we can write tests to make this counter work. So this is going to be our first interactive test, right? And that's awesome because that is what React is all about. So let's get going on the next one as we actually get this counter counting things and we can test that functionality.